Hi there, my name is Dr. Katie Saint, and this video is about ODD, or Oppositional Defiant Disorder. This is a pretty common diagnosis, and so I'm going to go over some symptoms, some facts about it, some myths, and then treatment options. So ODD typically includes easily losing your temper, refusing to follow rules, deliberately annoying others, blaming others for your own mistake and not taking ownership, being stubborn, unwilling to compromise or negotiate, deliberately testing limits, ignoring rules, excessive arguing, being hostile or violent towards others, property destruction, things like that. So, some facts about ODD. About 10% of children are diagnosed with it. It's more common in boys slightly, with 11%, and then 9% for girls. About 40% of people with ODD also have an ADHD diagnosis, which kind of makes sense when you think about the brain. People who have an ADHD diagnosis typically struggle with impulse control, and that also applies to ODD. That's a similar part of the brain that needs to be developed a little bit further or is overactive in both of those diagnoses. So about 13 to 27% of people with ASD, autism spectrum disorder, also have an ODD diagnosis. And the reason for the variability in that percentage is because there's debate on who qualifies. In order to have a dual diagnosis, the symptoms need to be severe enough to warrant an additional diagnosis, so that you know with confidence that the symptoms aren't fitting under the umbrella of the first diagnosis. Next stat is actually pretty encouraging. 70% of people with ODD are no longer diagnosable with it by age 18. So that means they've worked through those behavior problems and they're functioning pretty well. 10% of people with ODD unfortunately go on to develop conduct disorder. If you have this disorder, it is common to end up in jail and participate in criminal activity, things like that. So about 10% of people with an ODD diagnosis do develop into this. But the good news is it's treatable, and the bulk of people do overcome this diagnosis. So let's go into some myths. So myth number 1 is that trauma causes ODD. And this just isn't true. You can't take someone who has ODD and just automatically assume that they've gone through trauma. That's not a for sure thing. But it is true that if you've gone through trauma, it does make you more likely to have some of these symptoms. A lot of people who grew up in a home where authority figures were not safe people and were physically abusive to them develop ODD type symptoms because they learn that authority figures aren't safe. And so this is a defense mechanism. But at the same time, there are many people who grow up in really loving homes who also develop this diagnosis. So they haven't been abused, they haven't been through trauma. So we can't assume that every person with this diagnosis has trauma in their background. Myth number 2, ODD is caused by bad parenting. This just isn't true at all. So sometimes kids with super great parents develop ODD. It's really difficult to parent a child who has this diagnosis. It can be pretty challenging to stay consistent with behavior plans and follow through, and sometimes good intentions and loving actions can make some of the symptoms worse. And so that's why it's really important that any parent who has a child who's struggling with problem behaviors because of an ODD diagnosis, they should get some specific training on how to respond so that their efforts are getting the impact that they want. It's really tricky to raise a child with this diagnosis. Next, strict punishment is needed for kids with ODD. So the research on punishment is not that great. Basically, what it says is it's only effective if the punisher is standing right there. So if I'm standing in front of you telling you, if you don't follow my directions right now, I am going to take away your electronics, then you're probably not going to listen. So basically, punishment doesn't generalize. Take speeding, for example. We all slow down when we see a police officer, but most of us will admit to going at least 5 over when there isn't a police officer around. So that punishment of getting a speeding ticket, it's not generalizing our behavior across the board. And so this concept applies to all behaviors. But on the flip side, reinforcement does generalize. So when we get rewarded for things, our behavior persists and keeps going even when the person providing that reward for us isn't there. So that's a more effective treatment approach. So another thing to keep in mind with an ODD diagnosis is punishment procedures often result in escalated behaviors. So we should be really careful choosing what sort of intervention that we're going to use. Next one is kids with an ODD diagnosis are bad kids. So this is not true at all, and it's very important that we understand this because a lot of people who have children with ODD or work with children with ODD feel frustrated that the child is being disrespectful or not listening. But it's so important to remember that they're not bad kids, they're just struggling with bad behaviors. So all people alive do what works for them. Learning occurs unconsciously. And so for whatever reason, this child learned that these behaviors are effective to get them what they want. So what we need to do is change their environment so that they learn being sweet and kind and agreeable gets them what they want too. So that takes a decent amount of time. It's not going to change overnight, but it is possible, and the research shows time and time again that we can get there. We can work through these behaviors. So hold hope. Remember that the child is good at heart, and these behaviors are just what they learned is effective for them. Okay. Next, ODD is impossible to treat. So some people feel really defeated when working with a kid with ODD because they'll argue a lot, or they just feel like, oh, they never listen to me, there's nothing I can do that'll work. But that's not true at all. Like I shared earlier, about 70% of people who have an ODD diagnosis do work through it and are no longer qualified for it. So the research on effective treatment for ODD is so promising. ABA works really, really well. So keep in mind though, if we don't pursue treatment, if we give up on these kids that have this diagnosis, it can get worse and it can lead to lifelong problems. So it's really important that we keep with it, we don't give up, and we keep working through these behaviors. Myth number 6, medication is the only effective treatment. So here's the thing about medication and ODD. Medication has been proven to be helpful with this diagnosis, but it's not going to cure all of the symptoms. So it might make your child more passive or more agreeable, but it's not teaching skill development. It's not necessarily going to increase compliance, things like that. So we really need behavioral treatment to partner with it. But the most important thing to remember too is that anytime you're making a decision about medication, you should be talking with your doctor about this. ABA therapists are not the experts on medication, so that's where you need to talk to a psychiatrist or your family practice doctor to see if medication is going to be the right fit for your child. But with any medication, it's important to do skill development alongside with it. Next, let's look at treatment. So, choice is so important. When working with an ODD diagnosis, we want to give as many choices as possible. So there's something called forced choice, which means the adult or the caregiver picks two things that they approve of, and then they give the child the choice. So for example, you can do dishes right now, or you can do dishes in 30 minutes. Either way, the person needs to do dishes, but they get a choice on when. The more we give choices, the more compliance we're going to have and the less resistance we're going to get. There was a fascinating study where they were making kids do a fairly boring task. They were just stuffing envelopes, but they earned a reward. They could get just like a little bit of Coca-Cola. And so there was two groups. One group, the researcher just gave them this little glass of Coca-Cola. In the other group, the participants got to pick which glass of Coca-Cola they got as a reward for stuffing these envelopes. And there's nothing different about the glasses of Coca-Cola. They all had the same amount. All the glasses looked exactly the same. Nothing was different. The only difference was in one group, they got to choose which glass they took, and in the other group, the researcher just randomly gave them one. And so what's crazy to me is the people who got to choose which Coca-Cola they took did 400 more envelopes on average. So that is significantly more simply because choice was involved. So if we can just kind of rack our brains on how can I give more choices, how can I provide more opportunities for my child or my clients to feel like they have more control over their own life, this is really going to help. Next is clear expectations. So as a team, whoever is involved in this child's life, we need to be on the same page. We need to have the same expectations. If expectations are consistent and everybody responds the same with it, a child with ODD is going to resist it less. But if expectations keep changing, if it works with one person and not another, that's going to lead to arguments, it's going to lead to fighting, it's going to lead to non-compliance. So it's really, really important that expectations are clear and predictable. Everybody should agree on what is expected and where we're going to draw the line. You know, what things are we going to let go and what things are we not going to allow. Next is tap into their values. So instead of telling a child, you need to take a shower right now, you could remind them like, hey, if you take your shower right now, then at bedtime when you're typically playing video games, you don't have to cut out of your video game time in order to take a shower. So it might benefit you to do it now rather than later. So in that scenario, you're painting a picture of why it benefits them to do it now. You know, so if we can kind of get inside their head and think about what do they care about, what matters to them, you know, we can pitch things in a way that they can see how it benefits them. Like, okay, you know what? Let's just get these chores done really fast because then your mom's not going to hassle you about it later and you can just have that peace and quiet that you want. You know, so find a way to word things so that you're on their level and you're like partnering with them, helping them out, helping them get what they want with, you know, helping them understand like if you do this non-preferred thing, it actually helps you a lot and it leads to more peace for you, more happiness. So how we word things is going to be really important, and just partnering with them is going to help reduce that defense mechanism rather than coming at them like an authority figure. So how we word things is super, super important. There is a program called A and B choices. So basically you put all choices under the sun as A or B choices. An A choice is something that's going to benefit you. It's going to help you improve your life. It's going to help your relationships. A B choice is something that's going to lead to unpleasant things. It's going to lead to problems for you, hurt relationships, conflict. And so this is a great program to use with someone with ODD because you can put things in very black and white terms, and you can word it in a way so they can see how it benefits them. Like, for example, if they're making a poor choice, you can say to them, like, oh man, it looks like you're making a B choice right now. Like, this is probably going to lead to you losing electronic time. That's really sad. But if you turn it around and make an A choice, you don't have to worry about that consequence. It's not too late to turn it around right now, so you can completely avoid that. So like, if we word things in a way for how it benefits them, hopefully they're going to resist us a little bit less. So another thing to keep in mind, if we're able to talk about things proactively, it's really important to word it in a positive way. So for example, you could say, remember, if you do your chores, that means you get extra video game time. Versus saying, remember, you'll lose video game time if you don't do your chores. So the second one is a lot more negative and is way more likely to trigger arguing and to get that defense mechanism. Where the first way is positive and encouraging, and you're partnering with them then. So some things to avoid. Number one is just arguments. So it's really common that kids with ODD like to argue, and they will argue for a very long time. But when we're thinking about the brain, if somebody is escalated, if they're really emotional and upset, you will not use logic and reason to calm them down. It typically doesn't work. And what reinforces arguing is arguing. You can't argue with someone if they won't argue back. So don't engage, don't have the debates. It's not likely to be fruitful, so try to avoid arguments. Also, try not to be too authoritative. If you come on too strong as an authority figure, you're gonna butt heads and you're gonna get in a willpower battle. So if you can get on their level and partner with them, that's really gonna help. Does that mean you don't make rules and you don't follow through? Absolutely not. You have to stick to your guns and you have to follow through. But whenever possible, partner with them and explain how it benefits them. Explain how you have their good intentions in mind. So the next one is, do not set expectations that you can't follow through with. So if this child learns that everything that you say to them, you're going to follow through with, they're going to behave so much better for you. And a lot of times we feel like the nice thing to do is to give in and to reduce our demands, but actually that increases anxiety and it breaks trust. The child no longer knows if they can trust what you can say. And then they think that they have more control in getting you to make decisions, so they're ultimately the boss then. And even though children may think that they want this, it's really bad for their mental health. So they're going to feel more secure and more confident if you're in charge, if you're the boss. So that's why it's so important that you follow through with demands, you make clear expectations, and you have predictable boundaries for that child. So, to conclude, I want you to know and be confident that ODD is treatable. It can be a stressful diagnosis, but there is hope and there is effective treatment for it. Avoid power struggles whenever possible. Pick your battles. If they want to do their homework on the floor, that's fine. They don't have to do it on the table. Try to make sure that the battles you take on are worth it, And then always remember to partner with them. Help them to see how following these rules or these expectations benefit them, how we're trying to help them not screw themselves over. So if you follow these strategies, hopefully you will have a better time working with your child who has an ODD diagnosis. But if you want more support and you want more help, reach out. And there's therapy teams that can help work through these problem behaviors. All right, thanks so much for listening.